Hi, everyone. I'm coming to you today from the foothills of the Rocky Mountains in Canada, in Alberta, southern Alberta, Canada. I'm grateful for this opportunity to share some of my thoughts on chapter 14 to 26 of Orley Farm. Quote, "The conversation during dinner was not very bright that night at the Cleve, described in chapter 14. Gathered at the behest of Sir Peregrine Orme, we find himself lord of, quote, the exquisitely fair and lovely estate known as Cleve Hill. His family, consisting of his daughter-in-law, Mrs. Edith Orme, widow of his only son, also very fair and lovely, with marvelously blue eyes, her son Peregrine, and their guests, Lady Mason and her son Lucius. Lady Mason is also a widow, widowed not long after Mrs. Orme, and neither has considered remarrying these 20 years. They are now 47 and 42 years old, respectively. And while they have been acquaintances, they have both been living very much isolated from any intimate friendship. Lady Mason has felt, probably accurately, that himself would not have approved her becoming too familiar within the household. But now she changes her mind and decides to encourage a new intimacy. Why, do you think? Some of my favorite scenes in Trollope novels are the excruciating dinner parties, and this novel has many. In this one, Lucius is intimidated by feeling outclassed. And Mrs. Orme, as a rule, never spoke unless she were spoken to. Lady Mason and Sir Peregrine say a few words to each other, and Peregrine the younger is very limited and very predictable in his choice of topics. Hunting, of course, and after the ladies retire, drinking. Water drinker, moody thinker, and Peregrine sang a word or two from an old drinking song. I find that this novel, ostensibly centered on a 47-year-old woman, is overflowing with young men. Lucius is 22 and Peregrine is 21. Although they have known each other their entire lives, they are very different. Still, when Lucius decides to confront Mr. Dockwrath, who does he recruit as his second? He interrupts Peregrine at lunch at Noningsby, the home of the Staveley family, and the two cavaliers ride off on their quest. "I suppose he's not a man you can kick," says Peregrine. "A duel!" screamed Mrs. Orme. I didn't see her as a screamer, but her son is her life. Another parallel with Lady Mason. We meet two more young men at the conference in Birmingham, Augustus Staveley and Felix Graham. Both are aspiring lawyers and both are not having much success at the profession. Augustus, because he is enjoying the leisure made possible by a rich father, and Felix because of his weird notions. He believes that, quote, "Every lawyer should go into court with a mind resolved to make conspicuous to the light of day that which seems to him to be the truth. A lawyer who does not do that, who does the reverse of that, has in his mind undertaken work which is unfit for a gentleman and impossible for an honest man." End of quote. Eccentric notions indeed. I see much in this novel about the uses of language, how it can be used to find the truth, but is used more often than not as an escape from the truth. Was the conference in Birmingham completely fictional? A man named Lawrence Goldman, in his book about the Social Science Association, thinks it was based on a real event. Here's a quote from his book. In Orley Farm, published in 1862, Anthony Trollope seems to have modeled the International Congress of Lawyers depicted in the novel on the inaugural Congress of the Social Science Association. He goes on to say that, this is another quote from him, Trollope went further and actually contributed a paper himself to the Social Science Association's 1866 Manchester Congress on the need for an international law of copyright. It was met with acclaim. Something interesting about this organization is that it had women participating in quite large numbers. And the Goodreads blurb says it was the first arena for British feminists. Not too many feminists in this book, but well, maybe. Anyway, I can put that link in the chat later if you want. A few years ago, I decided to purchase the folio edition of Orley Farm because it seemed to be the only way I could get a copy of the wonderful introduction by John Mortimer. I will use Mr. Mortimer's words to describe Mr. Mason of Groby Park. Quote, when I, that is Mr. Mortimer, practiced as a barrister, I discovered that whilst murderers could show occasional gentleness and were, as clients, grateful for what you could do for them and easy to get along with, litigants in will cases had no such likable qualities. If you want to see humanity at its worst, to find families riven by unreasonable feuds and all good sense abandoned in the scramble for someone else's money, you should spend a few days on a contested will case in the Chancery Division. Mr. Mason has absolutely no need for Orley Farm. It is far away from his estate in the north of England. Natural justice demanded that his father's widow and their son should keep it as their only home. But natural justice is not a concept known to such people as Mr. Mason of Groby Park, who contest will cases. All they care about is their pound of flesh, what they consider to be their legal rights and the letter of the law. End of quote. Is Mr. Mason in any way justified in his quest for revenge? Is Mr. Dockwrath? Our narrator tells us, quote, all our motives are mixed, and his, Mr. Dockwrath's, wicked desire to do evil to Lady Mason in return for the evil which she has done to him was mingled with professional energy and an ambition to win a cause that ought to be won, especially a cause which others had failed to win. And he does need to support 16 children. When I volunteered for this section, I hadn't realized that I had the Christmas chapters. What a treat. My favorite Christmas quote is from Felix Graham in his conversation with the beauteous Madeline Staveley, quote, but the peculiar conviviality of the day is so ponderous. Its roast beefiness oppresses one so thoroughly from the first moment of one's waking to the last ineffectual effort at a bit of fried pudding for supper. And poor Peregrine Orme looks on as Felix and Madeline are falling in love. Another quote. More than once during that period of Snapdragon did he say to himself that he would descend into the lists and break a lance in that tourney. But still he did not descend, and his lance remained inglorious in its rest. But Peregrine doesn't need to worry. Felix, quote, was one of those few wise men who have determined not to take a partner in life at hazard, but to mold a young mind and a character to those pursuits and modes of thought which may best fit a woman for the duties she will have to perform. End of quote. What? We are left in suspense here with a promise that we will learn more about Mary Snow later. Meanwhile, Sophia Furnival is being courted by two equally energetic swains, with Augustus Staveley still telling himself that he can't be jealous of Lucius Mason because Augustus is only interested in Sophia as someone to lure his friend Felix away from the mysterious Mary Snow. It seems Madeline is a much more likely candidate for this task. Christmas festivities provide us insight into several marriages. What an array. Which married couple is your favorite? Perhaps it's because I am half of an old married couple. I do find them more interesting than the young lovers. How sad for Mrs. Furnival to be spending Christmas Day alone, while her husband indulges in the warmth and generosity of Noningsby. In stark contrast, we have the Masons of Groby Park. Mr. Mason seems to be developing into the villain of our story, but what could be a worse punishment than a life with a piece of work like Mrs. Mason? After a full chapter describing her stinginess, the coup de grace is that, quote, 4 mince pies had originally graced the dish, but before dinner, one had been conveyed away to some upstairs receptacle for such spoils. End of the quote. She literally steals the food out of the mouths of her family and guests. Spending time with the Mulder party on Christmas Day is more than just delightfully comic. It gives important background and advances the plot. Mr. Dockwrath made a mistake when he snubbed Mr. Mulder, because Mr. Mulder is married to John Kenneby's sister, Marianne, and John Kenneby is a very important and somewhat unreliable witness for the Orley farm case. Also, Mr. Dockwrath married John Kenneby's sweetheart, Miriam Usbeck, another important witness. Whose side will they be on, do you think? I was touched by Mrs. Mulder's life. Although not technically a widow yet, she is very much alone 3/4 of the time. And Mr. Mulder actually brags that his gluttony will bring him to an early grave. Quote, and if comforts of apparel, comforts of eating and drinking, and comforts of the feather bed and easy chair kind can make a woman happy, Mrs. Mulder was no doubt a happy woman. But if she didn't do her assigned chores just so when hubby was home, what the devil are you for, he would say, almost throwing the displeasing viands at her head across the table or tearing the rough linen from off his throat. It ain't much I ask of you in return for your keep. And then he would scowl at her with bloodshot eyes till she shook in her shoes. But this did not happen often, as experiences had made her careful. In chapters 25 and 26, we see two very influential older men very much in love with Lady Mason. Born Mary Johnson, her father owed money to old Sir Joseph Mason, and she was married off to him, a man 45 years her senior, and this is a quote, as his portion of the estate. She was sold to pay her father's debts. She was now 47 years of age and had a son who had reached man's estate, and yet perhaps she had more of a woman's beauty at this present time than when she stood at the altar with Sir Joseph Mason. That's the end of that quote. She has almost complete control over her speech and her body language. She is thinking all the time. She has petitioned both Sir Peregrine and Mr. Furnival for their help, and their passion for her is affecting their choices in some pretty big ways. In justifying an old man's passion for a younger woman, our narrator switches to the first person. Quote, "The old man may not twitter of sentiment as thou doest, nor may I trundle my hoop along the high road as do the little boys. The fitness of things forbids it, but that old man's heart is as soft as thine, if thou couldst but read it. The body dries up and withers away, and the bones grow old. The brain too becomes decrepit, as do the sight, the hearing, and the soul. But the heart that is tender once remains tender to the last." End of quote. Do you think that I was a mistake? Since Orley Farm was written about the time that Trollope was often in contact and communication with Kate Field, could it be that his own feelings for Kate, provided a model for the feelings of Mr. Furnival and Sir Peregrine? In closing, what I see as a very important question is this: whether or not Lady Mason is innocent of forgery, is she justified in using the love of these pretty powerful older men to help her in her cause when she certainly does not return their feelings? Hopefully I've given you something to think about, and thank you very much.